Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 9 from Biosphere, La Incarnazione de Poppea, or however you say that. Okay, so one of the things I've most enjoyed about Biosphere's music over the years is the fact that pretty much every album of his offers something different that you can't get elsewhere. Maybe an album will resemble his previous work in some ways, like how End Plants resemble his debut, but even that one managed to create something that felt new and fresh out of all these sounds that he'd used 20 years prior. So when you get to an album that has as hard a left turn as this one, that really doesn't have much in common with his previous work, that still sounds cool. Always good to try something out of the box. And I will say the idea behind this album sounds pretty interesting. Like, I've seen this thing described as glitch opera. Basically, every track on here takes clips from an old opera by Claudio Monteverdi, opera of the same name, apparently telling the story of the old Roman Emperor Nero's mistress, Poppea, and how she ended up taking the crown for herself. Now, I'm not exactly much of an opera guy myself, but again, this could be interesting, given its on-paper resemblance to what he did on his 5th album, Shenju. And when you actually listen to it, it definitely doesn't sound like Shenju. Mainly because of the source material and the way that these samples are edited. While the loops themselves cut at about the same rhythm that those on Shenju do, almost everything was thrown through this wavering filter that makes the volume go up and down at high speed. Aside from the last 2 tracks, which instead heavily stuttered these loops and made them appear to move slower. Gotta admit, it's at least an interesting idea. When I first heard this album while preparing for my review of the Hilverin Beak recordings a while back, I didn't really know how to feel about it. But now I've heard it a few times, I've gotten used to how it plays out, and I think my final thoughts are... this is almost certainly my least favorite Biosphere album. I wanted to say I liked it just because it was such an out-of-the-box idea that I've never heard anything like, but no, I don't think it was a particularly successful experiment at all. I wasn't huge on Tour de la Lune, but I feel like that one accomplished everything it set out to do and had an effective feel to it that I could definitely understand the appeal of. And not to say I think this one has no appeal that I can understand. Some of the emotion from the original samples does certainly carry through in the final effect here. I'm sure at least a couple of people liked it for its strange, ancient feel, but that wavering filter just killed it for me. If only a couple of tracks had this filter, like maybe 4 or 5, and none of them next to each other, that would have been one thing. You could have worked with that. It isn't too bad when the album first starts. But that filter never changes throughout the first 10 tracks on here. It wavers at the exact same pace the entire time, and it starts to feel like a shallow gimmick, eventually becoming annoying and even undercutting the effectiveness of a lot of these pieces. Not to mention, even without the filter, most of these tracks are way too short to properly leave an impact. Of the 12 tracks on here, only 4 are longer than 2 minutes. And of those 4, only 2 of them felt like they effectively pulled me in. Like the second track, Alla, Diletta mia, that had some pleasant orchestral tones and was early enough in the album that the filter hadn't become grating yet. It felt like it was adding to these recordings sounding super ancient and out of date and creating that sort of haunting feeling, but still carrying the emotion of the originals. I also liked the closer, Rimanti in Pace, or Rimanti in Pace. But I mainly like that one because it doesn't have the filter, it instead just stutter edits everything as mentioned before. But again, the orchestra does have a rather expansive and hopeful vibe to it that I could get behind. But even these 2 tracks are not on par with the material on Shenju. The other 2 long tracks fell flat for me. Tornerai, that had a lot of opera singing on it, and was the moment at which that filter just started to undercut everything. Didn't really feel spooky, just kind of off and weird and like the recording was breaking. That was at least better than the sequel track, Tornerai 2, where the opera singer started doing all these weird tongue trilling noises and the filter called attention to them in a way that made it sound like she was gurgling or something. It sounded pretty bad, not gonna lie. And the longest track, Mutata, Again, I wanted to like it since it's over 6 minutes. I felt like it was going to actually properly flesh itself out, but geez, this one really overstayed its welcome and got tedious. Again, loops a pretty simple pattern through that filter as usual. Plays a somewhat memorable melody with an old-timey feel to it that could have worked. But with each loop, that sample gets slower and slower and slower and more drawn out while the filter still wavers at the same pace, and that melody really starts to grate on my nerves. And I hate to say it, but that's everything I have to add from an individual track basis. None of the other tracks on here give me something interesting to talk about. This album feels really underbaked for Biosphere. He can usually pull off simplistic stuff like this. Again, it worked fantastically on Shinjo when he just lets the samples have their own space, let them stick around and get you immersed in them, and filter them in a far less intrusive way. And I get that this album is not necessarily trying to be Shinjo, it's trying to do something different. But here, it's not the samples that grab my attention, but rather the filter and the editing. And if the filtering and the editing were more interesting and varied more from track to track, again, that would have been one thing, but they don't feel like a substantive addition at all. They're so simplistic and unchanging and just distract from the overall effect. They feel like they're actively getting in the way. Yeah, not really a fan of this album. It's far from unlistenable. The idea on paper felt like it had potential, and I can give it points for uniqueness. But I don't think that potential was delivered on. I thought it was boring, shallow, undercooked, and didn't really pull off the effect it was trying to go for. Try if you're curious, but if you ask me, this is one experiment of his that you can probably skip altogether. I'm overall feeling a 4.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.